I grew shorter because Renee is taller, and he really doesn't wish to stand on the little bench that Ed Harris and I use. Rene Defourneaux, a retired U.S. Army major, is one of our own members, and his biography sounds like a James Bond movie. He was born in a small French village on the Swiss border, and he lived thereabouts with his family until he was 18. Crossing the border between Switzerland and France was easy for him, and smuggling became one of his more lucrative pastimes. Watching French customs agents process passengers on the Orient Express as they entered or left the country was exciting and helped shape his future. His father had come to the United States because it was easier to support the family while they remained in France, but in 1939, the deteriorating situation in Europe revealed the prudence of moving the family to America. Trained in tool making, Rene found work immediately. Following the onset of war in Europe and U.S. involvement, he joined the Army. Eventually, he was assigned to military intelligence school in Maryland. And when he left for Europe in 1944, he expected to take part in the landing. However, he was recruited by the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, which was the premier intelligence gathering agency of that era, and was immediately transferred to the British Special Operations Executive, commanded by Colonel Buckmaster. I thought some of you might have met Colonel. After rigorous training, shortly after D-Day, he parachuted into France behind German lines. There he trained and guided resistance groups, collected information about the German armed forces. A main objective was to protect General Patton's southern flank. Once the U.S. Army overran his position, he returned to the United States and for another assignment to the Asia theater of operation. After short stages in India and Ceylon as executive officer of an OSS team, he was again dropped, this time behind the Japanese line in northern Vietnam. There he trained the cadre of Ho Chi Minh and General Giap. When the Japanese surrendered, he was in Hanoi. After he returned to the United States in a short period of inactive duty, the Army assigned him to counterintelligence school at Fort Holabird in Maryland. After that came a series of military schools, and then he was assigned to Counterintelligence Corps, Special Detachment of the Second Army at Fort Meade, and a year later was sent back to Europe, spending 4 years as a CIC special agent in the Munich detachment. In 1954, he became instructor at Fort Holabird CIC School, and in 1956 was transferred as Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence in the Pentagon, with duty in Southeast Asia. For 7 years, he was involved in collection of information about communist bloc nations in that area. In late 1963, he was, to quote him, placed in a beautiful pasture called Fort Harrison as officer in charge of CIC's Indianapolis field office. In 1965, he retired from the Army, remaining in the Indianapolis area. He became a private investigator and later a vice president of Mid-America International Corporation, which is an international trading company. Following the sale of his company, he continues involvement in international trade as a consultant. Let's welcome our own James Bond.
For those who do not know me and who are visitors, please understand I am not a visiting clergyman. at all. I am just a member of this church, an honorary member, I should say. Oh, can you? I have to bring it up. Okay, you hear me now? Okay, I am not a visiting clergyman. I am just a friend of the congregation, and I want to thank you for inviting me, because I thought that after what I did last time, you would be tired of listening to me. Some of you must be sucker for punishment, because I know you've heard me several times, and here you are again. I guess you're here to make sure that I will repeat the same thing, that I will not vary. Also, I want to thank Beverly for the beautiful song. I don't know about you, but every time I hear this song, I get goosebumps, because somehow it reflects some of my own personal feelings. I don't know if you know what it says. The song is, do you know, not only the land, but my country, my house, because the man who is singing, or the woman, is in exile, and she's thinking about her home, where she cannot return from a faraway land. And it is very, very nostalgic and very sad. As a result of listening to the song, I felt that I should change the title of my talk. Instead of calling it War and Remembrance, I want to call it Why It Took 40 Years for Me to Return to My Old Country, France. This, what I'm going to tell you, probably will explain why it took so long. War and revolution make strange bedfellows. And you recall, some of you I'm sure recall, Hitler and Stalin, who were buddies for a while, then changed, became enemies. We helped Ortega beat Somoza, who was our friend, and then we fought a war against, or we tried to fight Ortega. Then Castro was put in Cuba through our own efforts, until he changed from bourbon to vodka. Then he became our enemy. France and the US have had fallout over the years. Well, de Gaulle was there. We never knew if we were friend or enemy. And right now, I'm not so sure that the French people really know if we are really friends or enemy. At least we are not truly enemy. We are just, relatives, distant relatives. Some of you have heard me discuss my involvement in Europe. After this, I'm sorry you weren't there, but you can get the tape. It's available, I think, for a minimum amount. I don't know how much they charge. You can have it from the office. And I returned to the United States, and after a short period training on how to survive under difficult circumstances, I was sent back to the war, but this time in the Asiatic continent. Now, you would think to go over there from the United States, it would be easier to go to the Pacific, but this is not the way I went. I went from the United States to South America, to Africa, and eventually to India. Why was this? Why did I go this way? Because you see, General MacArthur did not like the officers of strategic services, and he didn't want any of us in his theater. So we had to go a roundabout way to go to what we refer to as the CBI, China, Burma, India Theater, which was under the control of the British, under Lord Louis Mountbatten, Admiral Mountbatten. So actually I left the British and went back to the US Army and ended up under the command of the British again, because the entire area was under the British command. My first stop was Ceylon. Ceylon it's a beautiful island, and right next to the Bay of Gaul was a magnificent area. It used to be controlled by the Portuguese, and the Portuguese left much behind. Full of coconut trees, beautiful iguana, lizards, Anyway, it was nice until I found out that my mission there was not so much to go look at the beautiful palm tree, but it was to go on a mission to Sumatra. Sumatra is an island of Indonesia, and they needed somebody on one of the mountain peaks along the Malacca Strait to observe the comings and goings of the Japanese Navy. Why they had selected me for the job, I never know, but I was selected, and I was supposed to be dropped, of all things, in the island by a one-man submarine. I was supposed to go on a submarine, on a real one, on a small one, then scuttle them in the submarine and make my way up the mountains, along with a radio. I didn't like the idea, really, and I was very happy when my orders were changed, and I was sent back to Calcutta, where I had come from, and from Calcutta eventually to the border of Burma and India in the area known as Assam. We had an installation there called Detachment 101, which was smack in the tea plantation, and from there we conducted training of the local Burmese natives called Kachins, together with people who had lived in that area for a long time, who were of British descent, and we used the jungle as a means of training our people and ourselves. I was about to go on a mission to Burma when I received new orders taking me to China. Now, initially, when I was asked to volunteer for the job, I was under the impression that they were wanting me to go to what we used to know as Indochina, because I was French colonies. And every place I went, it seems it was under the British, because the British considered their interest above the French interest, obviously. Well, anyway, we went back to China. We went to China flying over the hump. And when I arrived there, my first mission was to go on a certain part of Yunnan, which is bordered the Tonkin region of North Vietnam, and there to meet some French escapee. Now, I have to give you a little bit of historical of a history of the area. You know, Japan and Germany were allies. When France lost and surrendered to Germany, France became more or less of a neutral. As far as the Japanese were concerned, France was on the side of the Germans, since they were collaborating in France. So they did not take over Vietnam or Indochina as we knew it then, but they decided to use this as a R&R area where they could send their troops for rest and recuperation, and the French, who had no way of resisting them, accepted them as more or less equal. This went on until March 1945, when the Japanese, noticing that the Germans were losing, the Italians had lost, things were going very bad for them, that eventually France would fall in a camp of the Allies. They decided to take action, and bringing all the French officers in one big party. They invited them to a sake party. Once they were all assembled there, the Japanese advised them or told them, "Gentlemen, you are our prisoners." And that was the end of the French army in that area. At least the staff and the top echelon of the French army. Some of the officers who were not actually incarcerated by the Japanese learned of this, they took off. They ran away with their troops. Not all of them made it. Some of them left without anything, barely, some of them without shoes. They were barefoot and made their way hundreds of miles up to the Chinese border, where they crossed the border and were placed in an encampment with a camp where the Chinese more or less, let them stay there, because the position of the French there was unclear to everyone. Because I spoke French, of course, I was given the job to go down and interrogate and meet these people. Now, you visualize here, I could only speak English in those days. I have trouble now, but in those days it was even worse. Here I come, speaking their language, wearing a uniform without any insignia or anything, half British, half American, and talking to them, where do you come from, what happened, and they opened up to me, and they told me all kinds of things. So we were very much interested in what had happened in that area, and some people who were in a position to help us were selected, extracted from the group, and taken away and interrogated properly by the intelligence officers of General Chenot, who had the Flying Tigers. Because what we were concerned is to how much damages have we done to the Japanese, and they were aware of it. So my job was to go over there and pick up this went on for a while until they realized that every guy that I become very friendly with had disappeared. Before you know it, nobody would talk to me again. I was persona non grata in the place, so they moved me out. About that time, the Japanese, who somehow were losing in the Pacific, decided that perhaps if they concentrate their effort in China, maybe they'd be able to salvage some of their winnings. And we were ill prepared to fight them in China, and the Chinese army was absolutely useless. The Chinese were fighting among themselves. The warlord were fighting against Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was fighting against everybody. Anyway, it was a mess over there. So, but constantly they needed more ammunition, more weapons, more supply. So it got to a point where we were really threatened by the Japanese. They were not too far away, so they needed reinforcement, they needed supply, and they needed drivers. And it happened that I could drive trucks. So I was selected as a second lieutenant. I was a truck driver, and I had 2 sergeant assistants. So we drove south and eventually relieved our supplies and gave our supply to the Chinese. And at that time, the policy of our country had changed drastically overnight. All of a sudden, we received order to use the French to go and fight the Japanese back in North Vietnam or in Indochina. So they gathered about a battalion of French and Vietnamese or Indochinese people who were soldiers who had been trained by the French, and we equipped them with everything, U.S. Army uniform, shoes, socks, everything, and we start training them or give them an idea of the training to do the things we wanted them to do. It was very relatively easy to do it because all these people have been in the military, so it was not hard. And guess who was the liaison officer between these people and our command? That was me. Of course, the French never considered me an American. They always thought that I was French, and they would tell me everything they did. And before long, I discovered that the French that we had trained, that we had supplied, were not much interested in fighting the Japanese. They wanted us to do the fighting, and the Chinese, all they wanted to do is return in Hanoi and reoccupy their colonies. They were true colonists, and they wanted to go back there and take over. I reported this very faithfully, and somebody somewhere in Washington or somewhere else decided that was not very nice of them to do this. So they said, we're going to take everything back there. And guess who they selected to tell them, we want everything back, everything we give you, shoes and all. They couldn't believe it. Then they realized that Renee did it. You see, they say, aha, only one guy could have, because they asked me why. I said, well, apparently it is known that you're not interested in fighting the Japanese. All you want to do is go back and who told him this? Then I was kind of speechless for a while, and then they lined me against the wall, and they were ready to let me have it, to kill me. But for one officer whose name was not French at all, his name was McCarthy. Can you imagine a French officer named McCarthy? He says to them, he said, no, you're not going to commit murder. It would be murder if you kill him. And he said, but we let you go this time, but don't worry, we'll get you. Someday we will get you. That was the first inkling that I had, that I made the French very upset, very unhappy. So it was decided at that time that since we were not going to use the French, that we would use the natives, the local, not the local, but the Indo-Chinese troops that were with the French, use these and go overland to Indochina. I was selected to be with a team with a French officer, and the exception. They decided a French officer, so they selected one, and the two of us and approximately 12 Indo-Chinese were supposed to go across the border, penetrate behind the Japanese line, and start organizing and creating a problem to the Japanese. So I was ready to go. We were ready. We were trained. Our radio was all set and everything, our contacts. When I received order to report immediately to our base, which was in a little town called Posey. Immediately. We were about 90 miles, so we rushed, walking day and night until I reached my destination. I was alone, actually, with coolies carrying my pack. And when I got there, I learned that that afternoon I was going to be jumping behind the Japanese line. And I would be part of a team called Deer, and that the commanding officer was Major Alsatian Thomas, and I was supposed to be his executive officer, and we had a medic, a weapons man, an interpreter, and a photographer. It was very quick a decision that they never asked me if I wanted to go or not. They'd say, okay, that's it. So they had packed me already. I didn't even have to pack. They had everything ready. We put on the plane, and off we went. Took us 2 hours to circle over those rough mountains. That's the roughest area I've ever seen. Eventually we dropped, and this is where I met in a little village called Chochu. I met a man out of nowhere. Now, can you imagine the jungle, with all kinds of green trees, and right in front of you is a guy coming in with a white suit and a black Hamburg. And he introduced himself as, I am Mr. Van. How do you do, Mr. Van? He says, our leader is very sick, he's very ill. He's in the village, in a hut there, and we don't know what to do for him. Fortunately for us, we had a very good medic, a trained registered nurse, who went to see him, and I was with him because I thought that I needed an interpreter. He needed an interpreter, but the guy spoke English as well as I did. And he discovered that the man had everything. He looked like a pile of bones with some skin stretched over it, yellow, a little funny beard coming out, few hair coming out of his chin, and he was rolled up in a corner. Our medic examined him very carefully, and he said, gee, this guy's got everything under the sun. He says he's got malaria to begin with. He's got dysentery for sure. He's got maybe dengue fever, very likely. And he must have some respiratory disease, he said, because his lungs are just. So I said, what do we do? He said, well, he'll die. He said, but as long as we have plenty of medicine, we just give him all we have, and we did. Give instructions. And we learned later on that his name was Mr. Ho. That was Mr. Ho. So Mr. Ho didn't play a very important role in the beginning. Mr. Van was the one we were dealing with. We had the equivalent of approximately two companies, about 200 men. And we started training. Normally, when we were used to do some training because we've been trained ourselves, we trained the Kachin. So we decided to train this guy, but the training was different there, quite different. In the first place, we had no contact with the people we were training. We had direct contact. Every morning at 6 o'clock, everybody got up, one in the field, and there was a flag, a red flag, and a hammer and sickle, and a star in the center. And they would start the day with singing the International. So there was no doubt that these people were communists. Although we were not told this before we left. They never say anything to us that these guys were communists. So during the day we as we do in the American Army. We work for 50 minutes and we take a break, 10-minute break. Well, we did the same thing with them, except during the 10-minute breaks, while we were either smoking a cigarette or relaxing, they had their political commissar coming over and taking over and talking to them about politics, about political subjects. And one of the subjects they wanted to impress upon these guys, these people, is that take everything these guys have to give you, but remember, they're the enemy. The reason why I knew this, because we had an interpreter, and I said, what are those guys talking about? He says, oh, they're talking about the future, how we're going to be, you know, enemies, how we're going to fight all the white people and all this, and the colonials and all this. So that was what they were already saying at the time we were training them. Mr. Van, who turned out to be Nguyen Giap, was the guy in charge of them. He was a former school teacher, very well educated man, spoke excellent French, and of course he wanted to participate. So when the time came to work with mortar, he wanted to try. So he said, okay, go ahead, except he was about to put a mortar head first into the tube when it said, stop, 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 you're going to blow everybody up because you're supposed to push the tail head first. So you see, the famous General Giap in 1945 did not know how to fire a mortar, and yet eventually he became the hero of Dien Bien Phu. But he had other talents, believe me, he had good talents. So, about a week or 10 days later, who walks in our camp? The old boy, you know, the one we saw half dead, walk in. We couldn't believe it. How the man managed to survive? It must have been tough. And he was all right, and he thanked us for taking care of us, to take care of him, and he says, well, how is everything? Fine. And he would come every day and talk to us. He would talk to me particularly because when we jumped in this area, we had taken with us a French officer that we had given a different name, and to pass him as an American officer. Well, he was not there 2 days when we were told to send him back. Now, how did they find out that he was a Frenchman and not an American, I do not know. But there is one guy that used to puzzle Mr. Ho all the time. That was me. My name was Douglas. I had a different name. I took the name Douglas. Mr. Douglas, how come you speak French so well? I said, well, my mother was French, blah, blah, blah. My father, I give him the canned story. Then he would repeat, where were you born? And the next day. And then he would keep asking me questions, because what he was doing, he was trying to have all these people find out who I was, and there was nothing, because you see, I was not known anywhere. So he could not, he could not identify me. And it was very puzzling and very unnerving to him, you know. You want to know who was this guy there that spoke French so well, and yet I don't know who he is. See? But he never made any effort to kick me out or anything. Everything went fine. But we used to have philosophical discussion, and he told me one day that he was a communist. He bluntly says he espoused the communist doctrine, and he thinks communism is the way of the future. And he used us to pass on information to our headquarters, to Washington, because we're the only one who had a radio, and he would periodically send messages to either the head of the army or even Washington. We sent a lot of messages for him to Washington, and he kept saying, look what you did with the Philippines, why don't you do the same thing with us? Why don't you do this with us? Why don't you let us self-determination? We are self-determined, he would say. We are organized. Somehow he managed to get through one of people he met, or maybe some of our group, a copy of our Constitution. And he used it to create and to write his own Constitution. Some priests who were in the area helped him. He received help from everybody over there. You could not help liking the fellow, because he was very, very amiable, he was very friendly, and he never tried to push his view on us anyway. He was just talking to us about various things. Eventually, the war ended. We were the one who gave him the news because we were informed with our communication system that a bomb had been dropped, and he wanted to know what kind of bomb, and we didn't know either. We didn't know what happened. All we know is that something did happen because the Japanese apparently had surrendered later on after the bomb was dropped. But the Japanese didn't get the news very quickly, and they didn't stop. So we had to defend ourselves more than attacking them. We did not actually attack them. And we got the orders, specific orders, do not take surrender of any Japanese unit there, because apparently at the Yalta it was determined that the Chinese would be moving to either 16 parallel and then accept the surrendering of the Japanese, and the British would move from the south and do the same. So we were in the limbo, we didn't know what to do. Meanwhile, while this was going on, and we learned later, is that Mr. Ho was busy making deals with the Japanese. And what I did not tell you is that while we were with him, we loaded his people with all kinds of weapons, ammunition, everything you can imagine, supply, food, and everything. So we really put him in business. He was in good shape when we left. So when the war, it was decided the war was over and there was no more Japanese, at least we believed there was no more Japanese, but Mr. Ho made sure that we thought there was some Japanese. We started going towards Hanoi. We were in the mountains of Tonkin, and we start traveling back to Hanoi. We'll go from one village to the next. Now you would think that as having helped him, that he would take us first, to be the first one to enter any village. Never happened. We were always in the center of the column. We were never allowed to go any further than when he says stop, which was usually about 2 miles before the village. And then after a while, he said, okay, you can come in. But every time we got into a village, there were always some new graves. And we asked, what's this? He said, oh, the Japanese, they had a big fight, the Japanese, some people died. Don't worry about it. But when we got to the village, all we saw was old women and kids. And the kids were not even with the old women. They were all under a hat, being briefed, being drilled by what they call the combo, the political commissar. And again, I asked my interpreter, say, what are those people saying? He says, well, because they were repeating slogan in Vietnamese, they say, or in their language, they say, what they're saying? They say, down with American imperialists. Now, we had just helped them win the war. These people in 1945 were training kids that high to hate anything that was American, French, and Caucasian. They were trained from there. And the guys that eventually we faced in the 60s and 70s. Okay, so we enter. Eventually, we reached Thanh Nguyen. Then from Thanh Nguyen, we had a little fight with the Japanese. They didn't believe the war was over. Eventually, we arrived in Hanoi, and waiting for us was a car, and we got into the car, and we drove to the palace of Hanoi, where the emperor used to live. When we got there, they treated us like, really, the local population were very friendly. It was completely different. Hanoi was completely different than the people we were with in the jungle, believe me. There was no comparison. They treated us like heroes, and wanted to do everything for us. We stayed in the hotel after spending a few days at the palace of the Emperor Bao Dai, who was introduced to us by Ho, incidentally. And this is the way he introduces. He said, I want you to meet my emperor, he says, Bao Dai. And we shake hands with Bao Dai, his emperor, mind you. The guy who was a communist. And when I shook hands with Bao Dai, it was like shaking hands, holding a fish, a wet fish. He had no strength in that arm. He just shook hands like this. And that was an indication to me that this guy was no leader and that he won't last very long. Because when Ho Chi Minh shook your hand, he almost took your arm with it, see. So that was a big difference between the two. Eventually, we had approximately a dozen Americans there, and unfortunately, one of them was killed by the Vietnamese. His name was Dewey. Maybe you have heard about it. He was the only casualty in Vietnam. Captain Dewey was killed by why, I don't know, but they decided that to make an example and kill him. That was it. We returned to Kunming, and after, thinking, gee, we did a pretty good job, the war is over, great, and we were counting our points, how many points to get out of the service or to get out of the area. And one evening we were going to go out in town, and I was about to go with the rest when one came in rather upset. He says, Renee, you better not go downtown. He says, what? He says, we just heard the French are out to get you. And they had some French soldiers there. They had troops in Kunming. I said, what do you mean? He said, boy, I don't know what you did to them, but boy, they're out to get you. They're planning to do away with you. So I stayed in our compound where we were, and I didn't go out. Then later on, I flew to Calcutta, and in Calcutta, I thought, gee, I was away from the French. I was safe. We went to a hotel, and as I walk in the lobby, one of my friends, if I mention the name, you know who that is, say, hey, Renee, come over here. I want you to meet some of my friends. And we were several, and when he came to me, and they say, oh, by the way, this is Lieutenant Deforno, and those two French officers got up and walked away. I said, what? Why? Why? I said, I don't know. He said, well, you better get away. You better go somewhere. So we changed place. We went to a different place. And when he returned, he says, the French are out to get you. I'm telling you, you better hide. and this happened once more later on. And even in the United States, the French made it clear that I was a traitor to their cause, because their cause was not ours cause. And they blame me for what happened to them, which I had nothing to do with it, obviously. So you see, for 40 years, after being stationed in Germany later on, I never dare set foot on a French soil, because periodically I would hear that if they ever catch me, they couldn't catch me in the United States, obviously. They would lock me up and lose the key or do something. So I'd stay away for 40 years. Now, I mentioned to you earlier, why is that one moment you are friendly, the other moment you are not so friendly? You would think that in the case of when you have war, you have allies, you would stick to your allies, you would stick by your friends. And that even though the French might not have been right to be colonial, we didn't do this to the British, we didn't ally ourselves with other people to beat the British, but we did this to the French. Now, I'm not going to argue whether or not that's right or wrong. What I'm concerned with is, why did we pick a man like Ho Chi Minh, a known communist, a people that we know the history of from way back? Because before I went, I had the great luck, I was lucky all along, to have stayed with a French consul, the consul of China, who used to tell me about one guy. And this guy, as far as he was concerned, was the guy who was going to be the worst guy of all, the one you have to watch. His name was Nguyen Giap. He says, we've been after him for years. He's the only guy that you have to watch, because he can organize these people. He's well trained, and he is just sly as fox, boy. You'll never. It turned out that Mr. Nguyen Giap is Ho Chi Minh. And it didn't take me long to find out when I was there who I was dealing with, because I had read his report, on the French reports. I said, gee, that sounds like somebody I know. And sure enough, that was him. Why did we pick this? Why did we pick Ho Chi Minh? I do not know. To this day, I do not know. But I will give you a clue, perhaps a valid clue, perhaps not. But who was the advisor to our president at the time when we selected Ho? The advisor to political affairs in Asia. Two individuals. One was Alger Hiss, and the other one was Owen Lattimore. Thank you very much. will be glad to stay after the service for a few minutes if you have any questions. So I'll be here. Thank you. What we did was probably more useful later than at the time, because we learned a great deal, and we were able.
That educated you.
Oh yeah, that was a good education. And one thing I learned over there is that don't get involved. I learned that, but I'll tell you.
As a Frenchman, why do you suppose there was such slaughter in Paris after de Gaulle got in there? As many as 50,000 people were rather quickly executed, no trials, no anything.
Why? Because they didn't want any witnesses. A lot of guys were killed, a lot of people were killed because they knew too much, they knew what people had done. And we're lucky, it could have been worse, could have been worse.
But it's never been really advertised or publicized that there was a huge number of people immediately put to death after de Gaulle was already in there.
They had trials that were, what do you call this,
and it was done, so much of it was done by the communists, whereas they had been on the other side.
Yes.
And helped collapse the government. Then they turned around.
The plan in France, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the plan in France was that the communists were supposed to take over.
Yes.
Absolutely.
That's right.
And I tell you who was in the deal. And he extricated himself very well. It's Mr. Mitterrand. Mr. Mitterrand was in the side of the communists.
That's right.
People didn't realize that.
And he tried here, when he got into power, to do something, and just took France back down the back road and finally had to, thank heaven, he's failing in health now.
But France in Indochina was a mess over there. But I can assure you that most of the people over there preferred the French to Ho, because Ho somehow managed to convince these people that they should commit suicide, and they did. They destroyed the dikes, which was stupid, because once they destroyed the dikes, this entire area around Hanoi, which is the bread basket, the rice basket, the place was destroyed, and they had no way. They were starving. When we were there, these people were starving. They had no, and Ho Chi Minh made sure that the school teacher, the village chief, and all these guys were eliminated, killed.
Those were the
Yeah,
bodies.
they were the bodies, yeah. We couldn't understand why we didn't see any, and those who could run away just, the young one took off. The one who had enough savvy ran away, but...
The destruction of those dikes in North Vietnam was just
it was stupid.
I heard a discussion of that once when I was in Sweden. The communists were trying to defend that position, and it's an indefensible position.
Well, they committed suicide right there and then. But you see, you must understand that life to these people is meaningless. I mean, they don't feel the way we do, see. As a matter of fact, if you go to a Vietnamese funeral, they have to hire mourners.
Oh, no.
Professional mourners, because they don't feel that to them, it's a wonderful thing to go, but
Thanks again.
You're welcome. Anybody has any questions?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Does France just continue this policy of agreeing and then being kind of lukewarm help, as in the blockade now? France is not doing much. It won't go against the Western Bloc, but it sure isn't.
Well, France has been trying to get back at us ever since, because we really did not. Say, we didn't do this in England. We didn't go to the what's his name, to the British, to the Indian, and say, okay, not kick the British out. We didn't do that. But in fact, that's what we did with France. Now, France eventually would have turned in the colony they were willing over a period of years to pass on, the control of this area to the local people, because they have plenty of them real trained. What happened, the moment the Vietnamese was trained, what did he do? He went to Paris, because the French had a wonderful system. If you went to their school and became one of theirs, you become a French citizen, and you were allowed to go to France, and then all the benefit and French benefit of French people. So many of them say, okay, I'm a Frenchman, to France I go. So Ho Chi Minh was left with nothing. He had killed everything, except of course his own crew, his own people, so like Giap and Travandon and all these guys. I knew all these guys, they were all with us. But one guy lost his life, stupidly. He was not very smart. He was a very clever, he was a good soldier. He was an excellent soldier. He became the chief of the defense of Hanoi. In other words, he was in charge of the entire Viet Minh armed forces in Hanoi. And he was killed because he got too friendly with us. He became very friendly with us, and immediately Ho Chi Minh got rid of him because he knew anybody who was friendly with us would eventually be unfriendly to him. See? He was ruthless. That man was ruthless. To him, dying was...
What was the second name that you said at the very end? You said Alger?
Yeah, Owen Lattimore. Professor... you don't know that name?
Yeah, he was in the papers.
Owen Lattimore. They never got him. They never put anything on him. But we knew we had enough on him too. But you know, it's hard sometimes to... But he was with the rest of the gang. The Chambers, all these guys were all part of it. Our State Department was penetrated to the hilt by the communists, I'm sure of that. But to prove it is a different story.
This morning, Gary Gutley interviewed a woman from Egypt who had lived in America for about some 6 years or something. And first she had thought she was feeling American, and then she went back to Egypt because she found that her culture was still there in her, and that she really was a part of that rather than this. So she now is, she had gone to school here, and she's back in Egypt as a critic of some cultural group. One of the things she said, and that we find difficult to understand, I think, as Americans, was that when, who was the Egyptian who was executed?
Nasser?
Sadat, yes.
Sadat.
She said that nobody in Egypt really liked Sadat. And of course she had spent some time in prison because she was a dissident, she and her husband. But she said nobody liked Sadat. And the thing that astounded me that she said was, it wasn't a personal thing. I mean, a killing, not a personal thing? That is, things like that are terribly hard, I think, for us to try to understand why somebody puts that kind of emphasis or that kind of a feeling on somebody else's death. But I guess it shows us how little life is treasured in other areas. That's why.
Life means nothing over there. But I learned one thing, don't get involved there. Because the country, the people, difficult to understand. And we learned after it was over that some of our best friends were from the north. Some of the guys who were telling everything were actually agents from the north. You never know who's what, who's who.
Should we become isolationists again?
No, we should let these people fight among themselves. We should not get involved. It's stupid to get involved. Because they're going to fight. You know, the Arabs have been fighting each other for millions of years or thousands of years. Why? Of course, we have vested interest. The oil is the key to everything.
Yeah.
That's right.
So that seems to be the answer. We have interests all over the world now that we keep trying to protect.
So you got to start walking.
Okay.
Don't use your car. Don't use your car, folks. No more car.
Now
Okay,
that we're
no
into
more.
the age of walking and bicycling, let's do
Okay.
more of that.
Right, and you cannot put wood in your fireplace because it's destroying our forest. What are we going to do? What are we going to do?
That's true, too.
Yeah. Any more question about Vietnam? This is a great country, believe me. A great country to stay away from. Don't get involved.
Well, we're glad you came and you became one of us.
Yes. Well, in the song that Beverly sang, it's a very nice song. Every time I hear that song, I get goosebumps, because the words are very, very penetrating. not the music so much, but the words. And it's about somebody who's in exile and he's thinking about where he came from. You know, and that is very emotional. Not to me because I didn't care about going back to France really, but I was glad to go back. After 40 years, I went back and met some of my old friends, my relatives, who hadn't seen me in 40 years.
What year did you go back?
In 1944, 84.
84.
84, yes. All the guys who were after me had died, see. I was safe then. I was safe. Yeah. I waited. When the last one died, I said, okay, it's time for me to go.
You said somebody even made a threat while you were here?
Oh, yeah.
Somebody was here?
Yeah.
Contacted